When we talk about being famous today, we think about, what, a movie star?
Yeah.
Maybe a tech billionaire, a politician who stays relevant for a decade or two if they're lucky.
It's a fleeting thing, modern fame.
Exactly. But if you rewind the clock about 300 years, there was one man who didn't just play the part of a celebrity. He basically invented the concept of the global superstar.
I think that's a fair way to put it. We're talking about a reign that lasted so long, it's almost hard to comprehend.
The number is just staggering.
Yeah.
72 years and 110 days.
It's just, yeah. Most of his subjects were born, lived their entire lives, and died while he was still on the throne. It remains the longest recorded reign of any monarch of a sovereign country in European history.
And we are, of course, talking about Louis XIV of France.
The Sun King, Le Roi Soleil.
Yes. Even if you aren't a history buff, you know the brand. You see the image in your head, the massive wig, the high heels, the gold-plated luxury of it all.
Precisely. He is the ultimate symbol of absolute monarchy. He is the face of what the French call the Grand Siècle, the Great Century.
But what's so fascinating, and what we're going to get into today, is that if you peel back all that gold leaf, the reality is, well, it's a lot more complicated.
It is. It's not just a story of statues and opulent palaces. The sources we're looking at today, from museum archives at Versailles, encyclopedia records, detailed biographies, even his personal medical history, they paint a very different picture.
A much darker one. This is a story about deep childhood trauma, some incredibly ruthless political maneuvering, and religious persecution that gets really, really ugly.
And it ends with a physical decline that is, frankly, quite gruesome.
It really is.
Yeah.
So our mission today isn't just to look at the monument. We want to look at the man Louis Dunet to understand how he built the modern French state, and more importantly, what price he and his people paid for all that glory.
I'm glad you started with that name, Louis Dunet.
It's so significant, isn't it? It literally translates to Louis the God-given.
It does. And if you want to understand the psychology of Louis XIV, you absolutely have to start right there, at his birth in 1638.
Right, because he wasn't just another royal baby. His birth was an event.
A massive event. His parents, Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, had been married for 23 years.
23 years without a living heir. In the world of royal dynasties, that's not just a problem, that's a full-blown crisis.
It was an absolute crisis. The court was rife with intrigue. The succession was fragile. The entire kingdom had basically given up hope. So when Louis was finally born, it wasn't just a happy occasion. It was seen as a literal miracle.
Divine intervention.
Exactly. And you have to think about what that does to a young boy's psyche. You're not just told you're a prince. You're told you are a literal gift from God to the nation.
It must have shaped his entire worldview.
It did. He didn't just think he was king by accident of birth. He genuinely believed he was God's direct representative on earth, that his authority was sacred. But, and this is the crucial paradox of his life, while his birth was miraculous, his childhood was incredibly dangerous.
Because his father dies when he's tiny, right? He becomes king at age 4 in 1643.
4 years old. I mean, it's unbelievable. Obviously, he's not ruling.
No, I wouldn't trust a 4-year-old with a TV remote, let alone a kingdom.
So you have a regency. His mother, Anne of Austria, rules on his behalf, along with the chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. And this is where we hit the first great trauma of Louis's life, an event known as the Fronde.
The Fronde. It sounds like a new dance craze or something, but the records say this was a series of civil wars.
It was. Between 1648 and 1653, France basically descended into chaos. You have to understand, the crown was trying to centralize power and, more importantly, raise taxes to pay for endless wars.
And the people with money and power weren't happy about that.
Not at all. First, the Parlement de Paris, and we should clarify, this isn't a parliament like in Britain. It's more of a high court of nobles and judges. They pushed back hard. Then the real heady hitters, the princes of the blood, his own relatives, joined the rebellion.
So basically, the entire elite of the country banged up on the kid king and his mom.
That's a perfect summary. And for a young boy, this was utterly terrifying. There's one incident in particular from 1651 that seems to have scarred him for life.
This is when the mob breaks in.
Yes. Louis is about 12 years old. The Parisian mob is furious. Rumors are flying that Mazarin has spirited the young king out of the city, so they storm the Palais Royal, where the family is staying.
They actually get inside the palace.
They get into his bedroom. Imagine it. You're a 12-year-old boy. You are forced to lie in bed and pretend to be asleep while a mob of angry, armed rioters marches past your bed. They pull back the curtains. They hold torches up to your face to make sure you're still there.
That's pure terror. That's a core memory you never, ever shake.
It was profoundly humiliating. And historians agree it forged two absolute pillars of his psychology for the rest of his life. First, a deep, visceral distrust of Paris. He hated the city, the mob, the noise, the lack of control.
And second,
A massive suspicion of the high nobility. He learned a brutal lesson that night. If he was not in total, absolute control, these powerful people would tear him and the monarchy apart.
so this one event really explains almost everything that comes later.
It's a psychological key. So he survives the Fronde. He grows up. And then we hit the pivot point, 1661. Cardinal Mazarin, the man who had been running the show his whole life, dies.
Louis is 22. And everyone at court, looking at historical precedent, probably expects him to just, hire a new chief minister and go back to the parties and ballets.
That was the standard operating procedure. Kings were supposed to hunt, chase mistresses, and dance. Louis was actually an excellent dancer. They were supposed to let the ministers handle the boring business of government.
But he doesn't do that.
Not even close. The day after Mazarin dies, Louis summons his council. All the important ministers are there expecting to find out who their new boss is, and Louis drops a bombshell.
What does he say?
He says, and this is a direct quote, "Up to this moment, I have been pleased to entrust the government of my affairs to the late cardinal. It is now time that I govern them myself."
Wow. So he's taking the wheel. No more deputies.
Completely. He declared he would rule without a chief minister. This was shocking. The famous quote attributed to him is, "L'État, c'est moi. I am the state."
Do we know if he actually said that?
Historians debate whether he said those exact words in that order. But as a policy statement, it is 100% accurate. That was his philosophy.
And this wasn't just some abstract power trip for him, was it? The sources talk about his concept of the métier de roi, the profession of being a king.
He treated it like a day job. He was a complete workaholic. He was up early, spending 6, 8, sometimes more hours a day in council meetings, reading dispatches from ambassadors, signing every single paper that came across his desk.
A micromanager.
The ultimate micromanager. He wrote in his memoirs that being a king was grand, noble, and delicious. But he also treated it with deadly seriousness. And his first act was to make sure everyone knew very clearly who was now boss.
And this brings us to the story of Nicolas Fouquet. This is one of my favorite parts. It's so dramatic.
It's a classic tale of hubris meeting absolute power. Nicolas Fouquet was the superintendent of finances. Incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, and maybe a little too flashy.
A little. He decides to throw a massive party for the young king at his brand new chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte.
A chateau that was, by all accounts, the most magnificent private residence in all of Europe. The gardens, the fountains, the art, the gold, it was spectacular. Molière wrote a play for the occasion.
And Louis shows up, and he's not impressed. He's angry.
He's furious. He looks at all this splendor, and he doesn't think, wow, Nicolas, nice house. He thinks, wait a minute, I'm the king of France, and I can't afford a place like this. You're my finance minister. Where did all this money come from?
He outshone the Sun King. A rookie mistake.
A fatal mistake. Louis was deeply jealous, but he was also genuinely suspicious of embezzlement. He saw Fouquet's wealth as proof that the state's finances were being plundered.
So what happens?
3 weeks after the party, Louis has Fouquet arrested. And here's a wonderful historical detail for literature fans. The officer who personally carried out the arrest was none other than Charles de Batz-Castelmore d'Artagnan.
The actual D'Artagnan? From the Three Musketeers.
The very same historical figure. He was the captain of the king's musketeers. So Fouquet is tried, his chateau is stripped, and he's imprisoned for life.
And Louis sends a message to everyone else. Don't get too big for your britches.
Exactly. And he brings in a new man to handle the finances, the famously austere Jean-Baptiste Colbert. But more importantly, Louis learns a lesson from Fouquet's house. He sees Vaux-le-Vicomte and decides he needs something bigger, much, much bigger.
And this, of course, is the genesis of the most famous real estate project in history. He decides to move the court from Paris to his father's old hunting lodge.
A swampy, miserable little place called Versailles.
And this becomes the masterstroke of his entire reign. Because Versailles wasn't just a vanity project. I mean, it was incredibly vain, of course.
Oh, absolutely. It became the largest palace in the world over 4 massive, ruinously expensive building campaigns.
But it was actually a tool, a political machine. You called it the Gilded Cage.
That's what it was. This goes right back to the trauma of the Fronde. He doesn't trust the nobles. He doesn't want them out in their provinces, raising private armies and plotting. So he comes up with a brilliant solution.
He makes them come to him.
He makes it social and political suicide to be anywhere else. He forces the entire high nobility to move to Versailles. If a duke stayed on his country estate and didn't show up at court, Louis would simply say, when that duke's name came up, "That is a man I never see."
And that was it. Career over.
Career over. You were cut off from the source of all patronage, all power, all favor. So he drains the power from the rest of France and concentrates it all under his own roof.
And once he gets them there, he keeps them busy with what seems like nonsense to us.
Elaborate, calculated, and all-consuming nonsense. He created a system of court etiquette so complex and so rigid that it required constant attention just to navigate it.
Life at Versailles was basically a constant performance.
A 24/7 performance. And the currency of power was no longer land or armies. It was access to the king's person. Proximity was everything.
This is where we get those famous rituals, the lever and the coucher.
The king's rising and the king's going to bed. These weren't private moments. They were public ceremonies attended by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of courtiers, all jostling for a position.
I was reading about this, the privilege of the candlestick. It just sounds insane.
It does to us, but to them it was deadly serious. Every night, one incredibly high-ranking courtier would be given the honor of holding the candlestick while the king got into his bedclothes, and people schemed and bribed for this honor.
So the greatest nobles in the land, men who should have been leading armies or governing regions, are squabbling over who gets to hand the king his shirt in the morning.
Or watch him eat his soup. Or hold his chamber pot. From a political management perspective, it's absolutely genius. If you've got your dukes fighting over a candlestick, they don't have time to plot a rebellion.
He trivialized their ambition. He turned warriors into courtiers.
And he bankrupted them. He forced them to spend fortunes on the latest fashions, on gambling, on maintaining households at court. They went into debt, which meant they had to come begging to the king for pensions and positions. He controlled their bodies, their time, and their wallets. It was total control.
And all of this is happening in a setting that is just visually overwhelming.
Right.
The symbol of it all has to be the Hall of Mirrors.
The Galerie de Glace. 357 mirrors. Now, you have to remember, in the 17th century, mirrors were an insane luxury item. The technology was basically a state secret held by the Republic of Venice.
So how did he get that many?
He basically launched an industrial espionage campaign. His agents lured Venetian glassmakers to France with huge sums of money to set up their own factory. The Venetians even sent assassins to try and stop them. It's true. So that hall wasn't just beautiful, it was a massive statement of economic and technological power. It said, French manufacturing is superior, and the king, the Sun King, is the source of all light and reflection. Apollo imagery was everywhere.
Speaking of manufacturing, let's pivot to the economics of this. Because gold leaf, mirrors, and endless wars aren't cheap. We mentioned Colbert. He's the guy who has to pay for all this.
Jean-Baptiste Colbert is arguably as important to the structure of modern France as Louis himself. He is the father of a system we call Colbertism, which is a very French flavor of mercantilism.
Okay, let's unpack that term. We all hear mercantilism in history class, but what does it actually mean in practice? What's the goal?
The goal is national self-sufficiency. Colbert operated on a very simple belief that the world's wealth, measured in gold and silver, is finite. It's a zero-sum game. If England gets a piece of gold, that means France can't have it.
So the strategy is to sell as much as you can to other countries to bring their gold in and buy as little as possible from them so your gold doesn't go out.
That's it, in a nutshell. So you stop buying Italian glass and Flemish tapestries, and you start making your own, but better.
He creates state-sponsored industries.
Exactly. He founds the Gobelins Manufactory for tapestries, St. Gobain for glass and mirrors, a company that is still a global giant today, by the way. He regulates the quality of French silk and lace so strictly that French goods become the absolute standard for luxury across Europe.
He's building the Made in France brand.
He literally invented it, and he built infrastructure to support it, like the incredible Canal du Midi, a massive canal connecting the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, which was an engineering marvel of its age.
But it wasn't just about physical goods, was it? Louis seemed to understand the concept of soft power centuries before the term was invented.
He weaponized culture. He understood that cultural dominance was just as important as military dominance. He became the ultimate patron of the arts.
This is where you get all the famous names. Molière.
Molière for theater, who satirized the very courtiers Louis was taming. Lully for opera and music. Lebrun for painting, who decorated every inch of Versailles. Le Nôtre, who designed the gardens. He made French culture irresistible.
To the point where everybody who was anybody in Europe started speaking French.
It completely replaced Latin as the language of diplomacy and international relations. It replaced Italian as the language of the high-minded elite. If you were a German prince, a Russian aristocrat, or an English intellectual, you spoke French. You wore French fashion. You built a miniature Versailles. To be civilized in the 17th and 18th centuries meant to be French.
Did an incredible achievement. He unifies the country, centralizes all power, and makes France the undisputed cultural center of the universe. But, and there's always a but in these deep dives, there is a very dark side to this obsession with unity.
Yes. His motto was, un roi, une loi, une foi. One king, one law, one faith.
And that one faith part is where the legacy of the Sun King gets very complicated and very bloody.
Louis was a devout Catholic. But more than that, he saw religious diversity as a direct threat to his absolute authority. He couldn't understand why all of his subjects wouldn't worship the same way he did. He came to see the Huguenots, the French Protestants, as a state within a state, a cancer on the body politic.
And his approach to this wasn't just, you can't build new churches. It got actively, brutally violent. The sources describe something called the Dragonnades.
The Dragonnades were a horrific policy that began in the early 1680s. The king would send companies of dragoons mounted infantrymen, known for being particularly rough, and billet them in the homes of Protestant families.
So soldiers are forced to live in your house.
Yes, and they were given tacit permission to do basically anything short of murder to make the family convert to Catholicism. They would beat the men, abuse the women, sell the family's possessions, eat all their food, and make noise day and night to prevent them from sleeping. They were vividly and accurately called missionaries in boots.
This is state-sponsored terrorism. And this was the prelude to his final decision in 1685.
It was. In 1685, Louis made what many historians consider the single greatest mistake of his reign. He issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revoked the Edict of Nantes.
The Edict of Nantes was the old agreement that granted Protestants rights and protections, right?
For nearly a century, yes. Louis tore it up. Overnight, Protestantism became illegal in France. Their churches were demolished, their schools were closed, their pastors were exiled. But here is the truly cruel part. He forbade the ordinary Protestant laity from leaving the country. He wanted them to stay and convert.
But they didn't all stay. They fled.
They did. Despite the risk of being sent to the galleys, over 200,000 Huguenots escaped. And you have to understand who these people were. They weren't just random peasants. They were often the most skilled, most industrious people in the kingdom.
Artisans, merchants.
Weavers, watchmakers, bankers, military engineers, sailors. It was a catastrophic brain drain. France's rivals, England, the Netherlands, Prussia, welcomed them with open arms. They took their skills, their wealth, and their hatred of the French king with them.
So he's actively weakening his own economy and strengthening his enemies, all in the name of religious unity.
Precisely. And he does this right at the moment he's about to embark on a series of enormous, incredibly expensive wars. Because you can't be the glorious Sun King without gloire.
Glory. It was his obsession.
It was the oxygen he breathed. He wanted to expand France's borders to what he considered its natural frontiers, the Rhine River, the Alps. Under his brilliant and ruthless war minister, Louvois, the French army swelled to nearly 400,000 men.
Which was what, the largest in Europe?
The largest professional fighting force in Europe since the height of the Roman Empire. It was disciplined, uniformed, and incredibly effective. In his early wars, the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, he looked completely unstoppable. He seized territory in the Spanish Netherlands and Franche-Comté.
But the more he won, the more he scared everyone else.
Exactly. The rest of Europe started to panic. You begin to see these grand alliances forming against him. Nations that normally hated each other, like the English and the Dutch, or the Austrians and the Prussians, they all banded together with one goal: stop France.
So the wars get longer and bloodier.
And catastrophically expensive. This leads us to the final disastrous conflict of his reign, the War of the Spanish Succession.
This one really was the beginning of the end for the Grand Siècle.
It was a 13-year slog that started in 1701. The King of Spain died without a direct heir and, in his will, left the entire Spanish Empire to Louis's grandson.
Which would have basically united France and Spain.
An unstoppable superpower. The rest of Europe said, absolutely not. And so nearly the entire continent went to war against France. The country was pushed to the absolute brink of collapse. They were bankrupt. The armies were being beaten.
And then, as if things weren't bad enough, nature decided to pile on.
1709, the Great Frost. It was part of what we now call the Little Ice Age. It was a winter so brutally cold that we have accounts from Versailles of the wine freezing solid in glasses on the king's own table.
And if it's that cold inside the palace.
Now imagine what it was like for the common people. The crops failed completely. Olive trees split, seeds froze in the ground. It led to a widespread famine that killed hundreds of thousands. People were starving in the streets of Paris while the king was still trapped in his golden palace. The contrast is just devastating.
It is. And speaking of the old king, his own end is not the glorious exit he probably envisioned.
No. I mean, physically, Louis was incredibly tough his whole life. He was a medical marvel in some ways. He survived smallpox, typhoid, surgery after surgery.
There's the famous story of the fistula operation.
Yes, an anal fistula, a horribly painful condition. He had it operated on, without any anesthesia, of course, while holding his minister's hands to show his courage. He then went back to work the same day to prove he was indestructible. The will of the man was iron.
But eventually, time catches up with everyone, even the Sun King.
It does. In August of 1715, he's 76 years old. He starts to complain of a pain in his leg. His doctors, who were famously incompetent even by the standards of the day, diagnosed it as sciatica.
What did they prescribe?
They massaged it with warm towels and had him drink donkey's milk.
Donkey's milk. For a gangrenous leg.
It wasn't sciatica, it was senile gangrene. An artery had clogged. By the time they finally realized what it was, the infection had spread too far up his leg. It was too late to amputate.
The sources describe it pretty graphically. The leg turned black, like ink.
And the smell of rotting flesh was so overpowering that his courtiers, these people who had dedicated their lives to being near him, could barely stand to be in the room. He was literally rotting alive in his bed at Versailles.
And while this horrifying physical decay is happening, there's this profound emotional tragedy playing out. He has outlived everyone.
It's the most heartbreaking part of the story in a way. A series of diseases, smallpox and measles, had just swept through the royal family in the years just prior. He outlived his only son, the Grand Dauphin.
He outlived his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, who was a very promising heir.
And he even outlived his eldest great-grandson. The entire line of succession was just gone. The only direct heir left was a sickly 5-year-old boy, his great-grandson, the future Louis XV.
Can you just imagine that scene? The dying old Sun King in that massive state bed, and this tiny, frightened 5-year-old boy is brought to his side.
And in that moment, Louis seems to have a flash of startling self-awareness. He looks at the child and gives him some advice that feels almost like a deathbed confession.
What did he say?
He told him, "Do not imitate me in my taste for buildings, nor in my taste for war. Try to relieve the burdens of your people, which I unhappily have not been able to do."
Wow. In the end, he knew. He knew he had pushed too hard, spent too much, fought too long.
I think he did. He died on September 1st, 1715, just days before his 77th birthday. And here's the final verdict on his popularity. As his funeral procession made its way to the royal burial ground at Saint-Denis, the crowds along the road didn't weep.
They celebrated.
They jeered, they set up picnics and drank wine to celebrate the end of the reign. They were just so relieved that the endless wars and the crushing taxes were finally over.
So after all that, how do we sum up this legacy? He left France culturally dominant with bigger borders, but he also left it completely broken.
It is a profoundly mixed bag. He is the architect of the modern French state. He centralized power, he created the cultural brand, he drew the borders that are roughly the borders of France today. But he left the country socially fragile and financially ruined.
And he created a political system that was maybe too rigid.
That's the key. The system of absolutism he perfected depended entirely on having a genius workaholic micromanager like himself at the top. It works when you have Louis XIV, but when you hand that absolute machine to a lesser successor,
The gears start to grind.
and the resentments start to build. You can draw a very straight line from the policies of Louis XIV, the debt, the taxes, the isolated nobility at Versailles, to the causes of the French Revolution 74 years later.
In fact, there's a grim postscript to his story that brings it all full circle.
There is. In 1793, at the height of the French Revolution's reign of terror, the revolutionary mob broke into the royal tombs at Saint-Denis.
The same kind of mob he had feared his entire life.
The descendants of that mob, they pried open the coffins and they dragged Louis XIV's body out. It was reportedly well-preserved, mummified, and black, and they threw him, along with all the other kings of France, into a common mass grave.
From a God-given miracle child to a common ditch. That's quite an arc.
It's the ultimate lesson in the transience of worldly glory. He built an image of divinity out of stone and gold, but in the end, the political forces he unleashed swept it all away.
It really makes you question our whole definition of greatness in history. Was the Grand Century, with all its beautiful art and architecture, worth the price paid by the peasant freezing to death in 1709, or the Huguenot artisan forced to flee their home forever?
That is the fundamental question. When we visit Versailles today, we're awestruck by the beauty. We take pictures in the Hall of Mirrors. We don't see the suffering and the bankruptcy that paid for it. But to understand the full picture, you have to see both. You have to see the gold leaf and the gangrene.
A complex man for a very complex time. He built an image of himself so powerful it outlasted him, yet died regretting the very tools wore and buildings that he used to create it.
A fascinating and tragic figure.
Absolutely. Well, listen, if you want to keep exploring the titans who shaped our world, make sure you subscribe to the History Titans channel. Liking this video really helps us keep these history files open, and maybe share it with a friend who needs to know there's more to the Sun King than just a big palace. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.